The hosts and guests on Everything's Messy podcast are not licensed healthcare professionals. The discussions in our episodes are not personalized medical advice. Always consult a qualified healthcare provider for medical guidance. Never delay seeking professional medical advice or emergency assistance because of our podcast. We encourage consulting with a healthcare professional before making any significant health changes. By listening to our podcast, you agree to the disclaimer. Thank you for listening to Everything's Messy podcast.
The way that I say psychedelics work to help us, especially when we have been holding on to trauma for a really long time, or we have been in fight and flight for a really long time, is that it can help us find a bit more presence and peace by helping us slow down. And really, they say that like hindsight is 20/20. When you're eating mushrooms, like you can start to connect the dots of your life in real time and see, okay, this is why I'm triggered. This is what's happening for me. This is how I'm noticing that this is coming up in my life. The way psychedelics actually work in the brain is that they work on what's called the serotonin 2A receptors, which are really densely located in this place in the brain, like a high-level space of the brain called the default mode network. That's where our self-limiting beliefs live. That's where our deep sense of self lives, and it's where our default mode is, like how we operate, our modus operandi, right?
Hey, welcome to Everything's Messy podcast, where we celebrate the beautiful but messy life experiences that most, if not all, people go through. Get ready to embark on an exciting journey through the raw and unfiltered stories of everyday people. Here, we dive into messy realities of life, from making messy mistakes to triumphs and everything in between. Are you sensing a theme? That's right, it's messy. But this just isn't about the mess. It's about finding strength and resilience in the midst of it all. We'll explore how health, fitness, and wellness play a crucial role in navigating life's twists and very messy turns. And we'll challenge conventional systems, because sometimes the most unconventional paths lead to the greatest discoveries. Join us as we embrace the messy, beautiful, and endlessly fascinating stories. Each episode is a testament to the power of our messy journeys and the beauty that emerges from the mess. So grab your favorite beverage, coffee, sparkling water, whatever it may be, and prepare to be inspired. Are you ready? Let's get messy. Hey, messy people. This is Everything's Messy podcast. I'm welcoming you to the show. Joining me today, I have Leslie Draffin. She is a somatic psychedelic guide, a sensual embodiment coach, and a menstrual cycle educator, along with the host of her own podcast, The Light Within. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you for having me, Sarah. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited. So just a little background for the audience. Leslie and I have sort of done a collab. I went on her show, and now she's coming on my show. And so I'm really excited to have her. She has a past in journalism, and I think that is just amazing. I love hearing about that. And we like to hear all of the messy stories, obviously, on Everything's Messy. So why don't you take us through your messy story?
Well, thank you so much for having me again. I think that my messy story really started when I was diagnosed with herpes at age 18. I am a preacher's daughter from the deep south of the United States, where things are very conservative. And so when I lost my virginity and about 4 weeks later was diagnosed with herpes, it threw me into a shame spiral that had me sinking even deeper into my eating disorders, abusing alcohol, and, which some folks may see this as a plus, getting really addicted to hustling, grinding, and achieving. And I'm the oldest daughter. I was already a type A perfectionist. So this really pushed me into this idea that if I was super successful and made a lot of money and did really good at my job, of course someone was going to love me. I would be so worthy of their love. And obviously that was really spawning from the core wound I had since birth, but what was really even exacerbated and made worse by that herpes diagnosis. And so for my entire 20s and early 30s, I climbed the corporate ladder. I was excellent at my job, making six figures. And from the outside looking in, I looked like I had it all together.
Sure.
But internally, I was suffering from debilitating anxiety, depression, what I did not know, but was later diagnosed with PTSD, and using anything and everything I could to find a way to sort shit out. And I, like I said, was abusing alcohol. I was starving myself. I was working out to avoid uncomfy feelings. And even when I started to get help with those issues, I still, went that Western medical model route where I had a therapist. I eventually would have a psychiatrist, prescribed anti-anxiety medications, antidepressants, but nothing really worked for me until I combined some of the spiritual modalities I started to learn in 2019 with psychedelic mushrooms, which I found in early 2022.
Wow.
And that, I think, was the biggest catalyst for change for me, is when I combined microdosing mushrooms with that mindfulness practice and the embodiment practices I was learning through somatic trauma healing to finally understand why I was the way I am and to get out of my head and into my body so that I could actually move through and process the shame. Really, that was a driving force and factor into pretty much most of my decisions, especially in my 20s, but also into my early 30s.
Sure. And so you talk about shame. Was it shame that you brought on yourself, or was that coming from outside influence as well?
I think that for the most part for me, it was internalized. It was this idea that I put on myself. Like when I got my herpes diagnosis, I was away at college, and I remember emailing my parents because I'm not great at expressing myself through words when it's coming into a conflict situation, but I'm great at writing it down. So, and my mom was always the same way. Clearly I got this from her. And so I had written them an email about what had happened, and I didn't go into dirty details, but
Sure.
gave them the gist because I knew they'd see their medical reports since I was on their insurance, and I had to go to emergent care because I was away from my college when I had gotten the diagnosis. And they were as supportive, I think, as they knew how to be, but the idea was just don't talk about it and it'll go away. But for
So
me,
unhealthy.
yeah, that was my spring semester of freshman year. And I just remember being so disappointed in myself for losing my virginity because I was such a good little Christian soldier still at that point, and really thought I had messed up. I had been dating the guy I had had sex with for years and years and years, and finally decided to go all the way. But I really felt very disappointed in myself, very alone, very dirty, very unworthy, very much no man was ever going to love me, and I'd be lucky to have anybody want to be in a relationship with me. And so that was, I think, mostly my own internal dialogue and my own inner critic, because my parents didn't reiterate those things to me whatsoever. They were pretty supportive, all said and done, right? But someone needed to sit me down and be like, bitch, you've got to go to therapy. But this was 2005, right? That's not something we were really doing back then, honestly, especially not me in my little college town. And so I think the other thing that did happen was, the guy that I was with did not have a great response to it. And I should also say, from all I can tell, I got herpes because of oral sex.
Oh, God.
So technically it's HSV1 presenting in the genitals, which can happen in about 30 to 40% of cases. But nobody was talking about that then. So he was very much thinking that he didn't really have these symptoms. He thought that it wasn't maybe I cheated on him, and it was are you serious? I've literally been with no one else ever.
Right.
So he didn't really respond that great. And then, I think mostly it was just continuing this idea of I was lucky to have him, so I needed to try to hold on to that relationship, even though he was becoming more and more emotionally and verbally abusive, and it was just not a good situation.
Yeah. Oh, man. Lots of mess, lots of toxicity going on there. Not only your own self, inner talk that you're talking to yourself, but even surrounding that. That's a lot to go through. So you talk about you went down the traditional therapy path, and you didn't get any resolution with that, I assume.
What I found validating and also disheartening was that I would sit in conversations with my therapist, because I had about 4 over 6 or 7 years. And they would look at me and be like, you're just so good at talking about what's happening. You're so smart. You're so it was like I was having a conversation with a peer, and they would say that to me. It's like I'm talking to a peer. You're so good at intellectualizing what's happening and what has happened. Yeah, no shit. I talk for a living. Like, that's literally my job. And so what I've found out, after all of this has happened and the multiple trainings that I have been in around somatic trauma therapy is that, yeah, highly intelligent, self-aware women, which is what I am, great at talking about your trauma, not great at sorting it out internally and moving it through somatically. So, I would sometimes leave there and be like, what the hell did I just spend 50 minutes doing? And it's not like I was in there crying my eyes out. It would be, I'd feel like I would leave sometimes with like a resolution or sometimes with an actionable step. But often I would feel like I had one therapist where I felt like I was her therapist.
Oh, no.
Very weird. And it was just a bizarre situation. And finally, the last therapist I worked with, she was really good. She was really supportive in a lot of different ways. And she was like the final one who was like, yeah, it was like, you're like talking to someone who's a therapist. And my friends for years had always told me that I should do this. I should be a therapist because of how much I would be mentoring younger journalists.
Sure.
And it was just kind of validated. But like tell an overachieving first daughter that like you're basically a peer-to-your therapist. I'm like, brushing off my shoulders. Like, of course, I'm great. I'm going to ace there.
Right.
And I did, but it wasn't helpful to my own trauma and my own internal story. And so I did find some resolution and help with anxiety medications and even antidepressants in my late 20s because I went through it and like talk about messy. Woo, girl, I had the messiest divorce.
Oh,
we can talk about that too if you want.
Yeah, that's a whole other fun
messy divorce. And so I was at such a heightened state that those medications did really help me manage as best I could, but I was also drinking daily, a lot daily. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I feel like when I got into my 30s and really had my spiritual awakening, I didn't want to go back on those drugs again and start to rely on those drugs again. And that's when psilocybin and magic mushrooms came in.
That's amazing. And so you're open about, taking the antidepressants and maybe the anti-anxiety medicine, and it gave you somewhat of relief in the moment, but there wasn't any long-term, calmness or peace or even moving to the next level, so to speak. You were just kind of stuck.
Yeah, they did a really good job of blanketing the core wounds that were activated by my divorce because I have a worth wound, right? Like I have a worthiness wound and this man cheated on me and I'm like, oh, don't leave me. I want to win. I want to win this relationship back. Lots of themes here of competition of like me being the perfect the perfect little good girl, right? But what was happening was they weren't doing anything except making me feel pretty blah. Like I would feel fine. And I always tell my clients, how do you feel? We don't feel fine. That's not a way that we feel. You're feeling something else.
Sure.
But I felt like that was really something that just made me feel like I was just going through the motions of everyday life. And it was okay because if I didn't have those medications, who knows what I would have been up to?
Sure.
Because I was a morning news anchor in an incredibly high stress job at that point. Like I said, drinking probably a bottle to a bottle and a half of wine a day and not eating any food.
Oh, wow.
Because I was anorexic and I was on Adderall. So it's just like, it was a really messy time.
Yeah.
A really
Sounds
messy time.
I can relate to a lot of what you're talking about, especially the ugly D word for sure. Like I said, that's a whole other podcast. So here you are and you're just sitting with all of this, right? You're just sitting with this mess. And I don't know about you. The word stuck just kind of, if you turn left or right, there's something else, left, there's something else, trying to get through the mountain on the other side. You're just kind of sitting with all of this. So it sounds like you had mentioned you found the psychedelic and somatic traumatic stuff a couple years ago. So your healing journey is fairly new.
Yeah. I mean, in this regard, sure. I started really becoming aware of what was happening within me in 2019 when I started meditation, when I started a mindfulness practice, and when I started embodiment movement-based practices. But I didn't have the language to understand that what I was doing, embodiment, was somatic trauma healing on its own. I was just doing things that, I either learned on the internet or through a coach. And so that's kind of when it started. So 19. The other thing that really shifted this for me was starting to live in tune with my menstrual cycle. So when I had my spiritual awakening in 2019, and started to understand that there was something called intuition, and like I could listen to it, which I had never listened to because I'd spent such a long time numbing out. When I finally tapped into that place within me, I realized it was in my womb and it was telling me to get off of hormonal birth control.
Wow.
So I did. In 2020, I came off of the pill, probably the worst year to come off the pill.
As we're all locked up, and now what?
Yeah. So in that year, I started really doing a lot of holistic healing with my nutrition, with my lifestyle, with my mindset, to get my period back, because I was on the pill for 16 years and my bleed did not come back soon.
Wow.
It turns out I was diagnosed with PCOS. My hair started to fall out. I'm still anchoring the news. And I had cystic acne. So like all of the really stressful things about your appearance happening because I quit the pill. And so the healing really did start to happen for me at that point, because I started to remember things that were bringing me shame. Like that's when the shame stories really came back up. Like I would meditate, envision myself going into my womb space, or even like give myself an external massage on my belly to help clear out some of the energy of the sexual shame. And I would remember all of these stories about like how terrified I was when I first got my period, how I thought for sure I was pregnant because I did not have my period again. Like I'm 11. Your period is not normal, regular whenever you're 11, and that's normal, but no one told me that.
Right.
And I thought for sure I had gotten pregnant. And I'm like, the only reason I can think this happened is because I must have used my dad's towel.
Wow.
Like, tell me how messed up that is. And
But you did, I'm not sure how old you are. I'm 45. We didn't talk about it back then.
No.
It was, here's some things to take care of it. And, that was it.
And my mom, I was adopted. So the woman who raised me, my mom, she had had a hysterectomy before I was born. So she wasn't a bleeding person. So I was not raised around this at all. And I was from the Deep South, where the only sex education was basically don't do it or you'll die. Something bad will happen. And guess what? Something bad did happen to me whenever I had sex. And so that just totally backed that up.
Oh my
that reinforced that belief. But, all of this stuff started flooding back into me when I started to live in tune with my cycle. And so I really think that that's when I started to understand how trauma is held in the body. That's also about the time that like the books started really coming out and people on the internet started talking more about like how we hold on to our trauma and our tissues.
Yeah.
But psychedelic medicine really only came into my life in early 2022. And because I started that for my own healing, I never thought I would be training and guiding people in it. I thought I would still just be a menstrual cycle coach, because that's how I started. After I learned all of the things, I went to a certification and got a little certificate to be like, I am a menstrual cycle coach now.
Sure.
And so much came up for my clients around trauma and shame and being out of their body and just in their head. I knew there was something more that could help them. And when psychedelics helped me so significantly, that's when I decided to incorporate that in my business. And when I did, and more trauma started to come up, that's when I spent about 9 months in a pretty intense trauma therapy training.
Wow.
Yeah.
And just, the trauma, absolutely. But I think, and you had sort of mentioned this too, we don't really talk about the impact of just the stress of the situation or carrying around that trauma that stresses out our body, our circulatory systems, our nervous systems, like all of this stuff that just continues to stress us out because we're holding on to that trauma and we don't know how to let go.
Yeah, for sure. I think back to when I was little, right? And this is something that really became like a story I became aware of before I started eating mushrooms, but certainly was verified when I started eating mushrooms, was the fact that like I was hardwired for stress from the utero. Like my birth mother, who was 12.
Wow.
Was basically like kicked out of her home whenever she found out she was pregnant, which was late in the game, like 6.5 months.
Wow.
And so, of course, me swimming around in the womb, flooded with that cortisol. And I would think back while I was doing these meditations, skip 30 plus years, and be like, why did I always feel as a kid like so terrified that the next shoe was going to drop, like always on the precipice of something terrible happening? And when in conscious life, I had a great life. I had parents who we didn't have a lot. I mean, we were a preacher's family. We did not make a lot of money, but like there wasn't really any conscious reason for me to look back and like pinpoint, oh, this is why I felt so worried from like age 5. And so then I think I was just addicted to that in its own way, went into one of the most stressful jobs you can ever imagine, where you're literally flooded with people's fight-flight response on the daily. You were in that kind of a job, you know. And it's like, whoa. So I was never given the tools to help myself process what I saw every single day. And still now, like almost 2 years since I left TV, like somewhere in the future, I hope that I'll be able to like craft some type of a program to like give journalists a key.
Sure.
To help them move through things, because like all I did when I'd come home is drink wine to try to shut off my brain and go to sleep because of all the terrible things I just watched on the news and the things I could never have shown y'all.
Right.
Never like that. Like
what do you do with that? What do you do? Where does it go? And a lot of times, I don't know about you, but for me, there was no final ending. We just moved on to the next bad story, and we had no, what happened? Don't know. On to the next one. I mean, what do you do with that? Where does it go?
Yeah,
absolutely. So get into, if you don't mind, a little bit about the actual psychedelic part. I know that my knowledge is very, very limited, but I know that I've read a lot of it with soldiers and PTSD and how that's kind of helped them come back and reintegrate into normal life, civilian life, and things like that. But you're using it as trauma from like what you were talking about. And so how does that work?
The way that I say psychedelics work to help us, especially when we have been holding on to trauma for a really long time, or we have been in fight and flight for a really long time, is that it can help us find a bit more presence and peace by helping us slow down. And really, they say that like hindsight is 20/20. When you're eating mushrooms, like you can start to connect the dots of your life in real time and see, okay, this is why I'm triggered. This is what's happening for me. This is how I'm noticing that this is coming up in my life. The way psychedelics actually work in the brain is that they work on what's called the serotonin 2A receptors, which are really densely located in this place in the brain, like a high level space of the brain called the default mode network. That's where our like self-limiting beliefs live. That's where our deep sense of self lives. And it's where, our default mode is, like how we operate, our modus operandi, right? This can get really rigid over time. And I think that what can happen, especially if you've lived a long time where you have had a lot of stress or you've had a lot of trauma, like that kind of gets ingrained into that area. So you're almost always operating at that stressed out level. And so,
like you said, you're waiting for the other shoe to drop
right.
Yeah.
Like my deep core belief was something bad's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And another deep core belief for me was like, I'm not worthy of love. So when we start to work with psychedelics, something happens and it's known as rebus, relaxed beliefs under psychedelics. And they can help to naturally, or this phenomena can really help to naturally thaw out our really rigid default mode network so that we can naturally question our belief systems. We might become more receptive to new information. We can change that rigid thinking. And that's also where this expanded consciousness notion comes in, right? From this awareness, this new expansive awareness from the very top level of the brain on down.
Wow.
And so that's kind of one way that it works in the brain. We also see that psilocybin specifically, which is magic mushrooms, helps promote neuroplasticity and helps to reconnect or create new connections within the brain. And so I think that this for me is why like affirmations never worked. And
I would totally agree with that.
Like they never worked for me.
They're nice to read, but it like, okay. And
yeah. And it's like, okay, think of the default mode network as a frozen lake or a lake in general, right? Like as a child, the lake is a lake. It's super fluid. The water's flowing. You can throw rocks in there. They sink to the bottom. Like anything you want to put in there, it's going to get tossed in, right? Throwing the rock in, makes a couple ripples, no big deal. When you grow up, your default mode network becomes rigid. And in this analogy would be like a freezing over of that lake. So if you're throwing rocks at it, an affirmation, oh, I'm beautiful, I'm strong, I'm loving, it's going to bounce off the surface and just skid. It's not sinking to the bottom where your actual consciousness and subconsciousness live.
Wow, great analogy.
So when we eat mushrooms, it thaws the lake. And we can start to look at, oh, what is that big old rock in there? Is that my self-limiting belief about the fact that I'm not worthy of love? Let's take that shit out
Yeah.
and put something new in. So you can have more movement. So I think that that's one reason why I have seen it really help me, because it's helped me manage my anxiety. It's helped me manage my depression. And for me and my PTSD specifically, because I haven't worked a lot with other people, I certainly haven't worked with any veterans in this realm. I have worked with veterans before around their cycle specifically. But for me and my PTSD, what really started to happen was I was able through psychedelics to notice the sensations within my body that would come up before I'd have like a panic attack, or I'd have these just like ruminating thoughts that sometimes were triggered by what I'd see on television or so on and so forth. And so the sensations and the ability to notice those sensations and then move through them so they could come to completion versus getting stuck, right?
Wow.
That's another thing that somatic psychedelic use, which is the way that I use it, can help us too, because we're really becoming aware of what's happening in the body. And when we understand that, like, the sensations in our body actually form the story in our head. About 80% of what's happening is in the body. 20% is your mind making a meaning. And your mind will lie to you big time.
To keep you safe.
Yeah, to keep you safe. Like, your mind's so smart. It wants you to survive. And also it would lie to you based on your cultural and societal programming, like it did for me, right?
Sure.
Because somebody might get diagnosed with herpes and not have the same shame story that I did. They might move on and not have it be a big deal in their life. That was a core defining moment for me. So I think that what's really interesting about the sensation and the way that psychedelics allow us to come home to our bodies is, again, that idea that, like, we can see what's happening to us in real time. I almost think it's like me standing over like a map of my life, and it's like I'm just like playing connect the dots, like, oh, this is what's happening in this and this. It's you're able to respond versus react in the moment. And I see it play out in my relationships, in my marriage, in my, like, I just posted about this, like, my brother and sister-in-law moved less than a mile away. They have 3 kids. I'm not a parent, but I'm a very involved aunt now. And, like, thank the goddess for microdosing, because the Leslie who was here 5 to 6 years ago would have been so, like, triggered, and I still get triggered, but, like, so much more stressed by these little kids who, let's be honest, are the divine mirror of me. These little girls are like exactly what I was like. And I'm like, oh, I see you, universe. I see you, this cosmic joke. I didn't even have to birth these children to have them mirror me and let me see all my triggers in them. So that's some of the reasons how psychedelic works, and how it's certainly been helping me.
Right. And would you say, and I try to be careful with this word, but especially after my heart attack, I was really looking for a sense of taking back some of my power. And so would you say that this sort of, I don't know, maybe falsely, but kind of makes you feel like you've got some power back from the trauma and the stress and the things that you've gone through?
I wouldn't say falsely. I think that psychedelics will help you know yourself, and reset your shit, truly. And I think that what's interesting is, so we talked about the science behind it, right? And I'm not like a sciencey person. I am a witch. Like, I want the spiritual side, right? Like, I only tell the science part because some folks really need that to, like, believe it. But for me, when I started working with it, I didn't know anything about how it worked in the brain. I didn't care. It's like, I heard somebody on a podcast talk about it. I immediately had her on my show and then hired her. Her name's Bijou. And for me, what made the aha connection was that mushrooms, when we look at the mycelium network, we look at how they connect under our soil, and they're able to help plants communicate, and trees get nutrients from this other tree on the other side of the forest because they know that other tree is sick. It's like, when you look at how smart the mycelium network is and how sentient I believe it is, and mushrooms as that byproduct of that energy, I really was so interested to discover how it would help me connect with my own self and see myself in a new light. Because I think that for me, mushrooms are just such a loving consciousness. They're an energy that makes us feel connected because they come from utter connection, right? They're the reason we have this planet. They came down, the spores landed on our rock, eventually made it into a soil that could sustain life, that then helped the plants, blah, blah, blah. Believe whatever you want to believe. That's what I believe. And I really just feel like this is like it's such an amazing, loving consciousness. And when we look at the full dose journeys, right? Like when you're really tripping, because you don't trip when you microdose. You're taking such a tiny amount that you can go about everyday life. You're not intoxicated whatsoever. But when you do...
So it's not a sense of high?
Not at all.
No.
Microdosing, not at all.
It really just opens up to receive new information?
I feel like... So a microdose is about 1/10 to 1/20 of a full dose journey. And at that level, which is usually 0.1 to 0.05 grams, so 50 milligrams to 100 milligrams, up to like 300 milligrams. What I like to say is that when you're really tapped in, like let's say you've got a mindfulness practice already, or you're someone who can get into a bit of stillness, you will notice an openness, which sometimes feels like more emotions, which sometimes feels like more patience, which often feels like just being able to like zone in on something, be it your meditation, be it your work, be it creativity, but you're not feeling high. You could, if I was going to relate it to something, sometimes it feels like I've had a cup of coffee, where I feel alert. I feel like, okay, I'm ready to start the day. I feel energized. And sometimes it's like I've had a glass of wine, where I feel much calmer. Maybe I'll feel a bit of a buzzy sensation, but if you're feeling the buzzing or spiciness internally is how I usually refer to it, that might be a sign that you've taken a little bit more than a microdose.
Okay.
But that's you don't need to feel it in order to have it work.
And that's when you talk about it sort of feels like a glass of wine, that's what you talk about, it taking the edge off with the anxiety?
Yes and no. So when I say it helped me with my anxiety, it helped me follow the thought patterns back to where the roots were. Why was I anxious in the first place? What sensations in my body are telling me that I'm anxious? And is this an actual fact? Because sometimes the sensations that I would attribute to anxiety were actually not anxiety. It was just my body and brain were so hardwired to think, oh, you're an anxious person. You're a high-strung person. My mom told me I was high-strung since I was like an infant. But in reality, I might not be actually anxious. I might be scared. I might be mad. I might feel uneasy. I might feel all these other things. And like I said, the sensations in the body tell 80% of the story. But when we let our brain be the thing that we listen to most, of course, it's going to go with whatever
we get
it
a different story.
Yeah. And it knew for me that it was anxiety. But yes, it also physically did help me feel a little bit less anxious, especially in certain scenarios. So I have been sober for about 1.5 years. And I will consciously, thank you, I'll consciously microdose if I'm going to go out and be in a huge crowd. I now understand I'm a very highly sensitive person and I had social anxiety. And so I would drink to feel accepted and okay with all of these energies. And so now if I know I'm going to be in a situation like that, I'll often microdose or take a little more than a microdose so that I kind of feel more grounded. And that's because I've done a lot of work with this. It's not something I would recommend for folks who have a high level of
Nobody
anxiety.
go out and just take it for a party.
If you're an anxious person and you know social interactions make you more anxious and you've never worked with microdosing or psilocybin before, do not recommend doing it like that. But it could be something that in the future, after you've worked and understood it, that it could work for you. And the reason I say it might not work is because these can be non-specific expanders or amplifiers. And that basically means that if you're in an anxiety tunnel or a depressive episode or panic or big time grief, and you choose to work with this medicine, it could make things worse.
Make it worse. Okay.
Because again, it's expanding. It's really just amplifying other things. And so sometimes, even when I microdose with a big crowd, it can amplify the energy. And I'm like, nope, we got to leave.
Got to go.
I messed up, you know?
And I like what you say about it's not just an easy fix, here's a pill or whatever. It's you also have to put the work into yourself with other mindful practices in order to achieve what you're talking about. So it's not just here, take a shroom, have fun.
Right.
It's not, you're not going to get the result that you want. You have to put the work in.
Yeah. I always say that psilocybin helps to open the door to your subconscious and holds your hand while you walk through.
Sure. But you have to be prepared and ready to walk through.
Yeah. It's not going to carry you along. It's not going to fix you. And it's not often a quick fix. So the way that microdosing works is that it's sort of a layering on effect, like a compounding. So the more you microdose over time, often the more benefits you see. While some folks do have amazing experiences very quickly with microdosing, had a client I talked to today who had some really epic things happen in her first week. For me and my practice, it's usually around week 6 of a 12-week protocol that we start to see people like have these aha moments. And so again, like
that's work. That's putting in the work.
And yet also, you know, when you look at the difference between the way psilocybin is being used, especially in some studies for anxiety and depression, and SSRIs and SNRIs, psilocybin looks like it is working quicker, even than those other pharmaceutical drugs with far fewer side effects. Like the biggest side effect of psilocybin is you'll get sleepy.
And that's sometimes a good side effect.
Yeah. Or you might take a little too much and then everything is a bit more magical for a couple hours and you can't leave the house. So, but it's not like the side effects that I experienced with anxiety and depression meds where I had no libido. I was like cranky. Coming off of them was like, oh my gosh, an act of Congress and an incredibly painful one. So I kind of say that is your journey with psilocybin is going to be very unique to you.
Sure.
And people like me are around to help be a mentor, help be a guide so that you're not there on a path alone.
Yeah. And definitely if you're serious about it, get a coach to help you for sure.
Like I got one that I started this practice with a coach and never did it before. I did trip mushrooms once recreationally with my husband. It was great. We ended up keeping our dog. We were fostering her. It was excellent. It was a beautiful time. But I really credit having that person to like hold space for me as I walked this journey as the most impactful part of this for me in the beginning. I think that especially if you're really wanting to devote yourself to healing, if you've tried all of the other stuff, if you've already been to therapy for years, and you know this is something that you're interested in, I feel like guidance is pretty important.
Yeah, for sure. And I find it kind of fascinating. So you have seen both sides and what that each did for you, and still, a few more years into this journey, do you ever experience somebody that wants to, but maybe they're afraid because they don't know how they'll react?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's such a normal thing. Such a normal thing. And
does it keep them from feeling the full effects because they're scared?
So let's talk about two things. First, for folks who are scared before they start, and scared to start, I think that's really normal. I think it's a very normal thought, especially with the way that our media, speaking as a veteran of the media, likes to put this idea out there that you're going to lose yourself. You're going to lose your mind. To find your mind, maybe. I
was going to say, I've already lost my mind.
Seriously, that's how it happened for me. I had to lose so much to find who I am. But the second part of this, if they're scared and then they still go into an experience, again, that can be an instance where it might amplify the fear. And that's often where we see those really challenging or quote unquote bad trips happen on the full dose scale. So when you're eating enough mushrooms to trip, hallucinate, which is usually 2 grams or more, and you're going in there with fear, or you're going in there with a bad, you're in a place that you're not comfortable, you're tripping at a music festival or out in the woods by yourself. God, I hope not.
Don't recommend that.
Right? Do not recommend. That's when, yes, that really can become amplified. And that's one of the reasons why part of the work I do is helping people prep for those big journeys. Because if you do have fear, that's totally normal. And things I do are help you walk through that. Where is it coming from? What are you worried will happen? Do you feel like things that you've heard in the past might be reasons you feel fear now? And how can we set you up for success so that when you're in that moment, you aren't afraid? On the microdosing level, though, because it's so teeny, usually it just takes one time microdosing for folks to understand that, I'm not outside of myself. I'm not there's nothing to be afraid of in this situation. I'm not losing control of anything. when we find our correct dose, we can do any and everything. Like I microdosed before this conversation.
I love it.
Used to microdose before I anchored the news. Drive, parent, all the things. And that's why microdosing is such a wonderful ally on the healing journey, because unlike a full dose, you don't have to set aside like a whole weekend to go and trip. You're doing this and you're integrating it into your daily life. And again, that's why I think it's so healing and so beneficial, especially for busy modern women and busy moms.
Definitely. Definitely. So what are your thoughts on, I've heard a lot of things lately about mushroom coffee and mushroom for hormones and things like that. What are your thoughts on all that?
So those are usually talking about medicinal mushrooms like lion's mane, cordyceps. And I'm going to be honest, I don't really like mushrooms. Like I don't love the taste of, I'm trying to get better about it. And I'm trying to like actually eat them more as in like food and culinary. But I think that, again, they're coming from the mycelium network, whether they've got psychedelics in them or not. And so I really think that some of the research around brain activity specifically is really interesting. One of the really like heavy hitters in this industry, Paul Stamets, really touts stacking with psilocybin. So he has this protocol he created that basically stacks psilocybin, lion's mane, and niacin to really help with like brain development. I have never done his stack in that way. I don't like to add in additional things to psilocybin, maybe cacao, which is a heart opener, because I'm not trying to like really biohack a lot of things. I've noticed folks want to turn to mushrooms, either the psychedelic kind or the medicinal kind, for like biohacking. And I think that that has its place. And for me in my life right now, like I want to meet the cosmos. Like I want to meet God. I don't really want to know how I can like optimize my workflow.
Change your DNA.
Although it certainly has. Yeah, it certainly does in its own way. I haven't done a ton of research on the mushroom coffees, but I went for a long time being caffeine free and looked into like I think I tasted one time and it was all right. But yeah, I think that mushrooms are having a huge resurgence, just as the psychedelic renaissance is happening as well, as we see millions and millions of dollars being put into research all across the country and world about how plant and earth medicine, these fungi teachers, can help us. So sure, medicinal mushrooms, great. Give them a try. I'm just not super well versed in all the different things.
So, and then I guess the big $64 million question, if you will, is it considered illegal?
Yes.
Yes.
In a lot of places. Yep. So I think
so this isn't something you can go on Amazon and just purchase or go to Trader Joe's and buy, right? So it has to be, okay.
Right. So states across the country have differing rules and laws. So Colorado and Oregon are really the two main places, along with DC and a couple other states that are in the process of shifting their rules, that have either decriminalized psilocybin or made it totally legal. And still, even though I know Oregon and Colorado have made those big shifts, we're still seeing the after effects, much like cannabis, right? Like it's going to take a little bit of time to sort things out. So when I decided to start microdosing, I was still employed. And like I said, I would microdose and go to work later. And I really had to sort out like the risk factor for myself because it's illegal where I live. And I looked at the research and I meditated on it and I looked at all the things I had already tried. I looked at how low of a risk it is. And for me, like as in a risk to my own personal self, not necessarily the law, right? For me, it was worth the risk. And I felt really safe in the container I was in with my coach because I knew where my source was coming from and I believed in it, that it was going to be okay. And so for folks who are listening and may live in a place like I do where it is technically illegal, Schedule 1 narcotic allegedly has no benefits, although the DEA will have to change their tune soon. I know it, like probably in the next 3 years. Because you cannot deny, I don't know if they'll make it like legal or decriminalize it, but they're going to have to shift its Schedule 1 classification because there's no way they're going to be able to deny all of these studies coming out.
Wow.
But I would just say, look at your own personal life, look at whether or not it's a risk you want to take. And while I don't tell people where to get mushrooms, don't get them on the internet from places, people that will comment on this episode. They will be like, I love mushrooms, get them from so-and-so. It's like no. It's some stupid like IG too. It'll be like, just make it up. Like Shroomy Shrooms 101 at Shroomy. Like, don't, if you see someone commenting on a post of mine or a post on this podcast, like, that's not how you get them. If you're interested in finding out, you can look for your local psychedelic society. Just Google wherever you live, psychedelic society. Texas has many. I started one for Central Texas. Talk to folks at your local
That's
metaphysical
interesting
store.
that you're in Texas. Although I do know slowly that Texas is not as rigid as it once proclaimed to be, and I have family in Texas. But I would think it's sort of the last state standing that would ever want to make this any form of it, because marijuana is still illegal in Texas, right?
Well, we have a very flexible hemp law, the Hemp Farm Act,
Okay.
that is really full of loopholes, full of
Gotcha.
holes,
Gotcha.
loopy kind. And because our state legislature only meets twice, like once every 2 years, like, yeah, it is no man's land out here. But
I mean, I love it. My family's out there. We're the only ones left in California. I mean, it's great, but it's like sometimes stepping back in time when you get into some of those smaller counties, the dry counties and other things like that.
Like, seriously, that's another podcast, right? Like the back ass place I live. Yeah. I was really surprised that California, that Newsom decided to X the legislation that came out last year.
Yeah.
For psilocybin in California. I think you'll get your act together, I would say, pretty soon, if they can.
We usually follow in tow with Colorado and Oregon. So the fact that we didn't, it's like somebody didn't grease the right hands with the right amount of money or something.
100%. Like there was something in that rule that somebody didn't like. And I'm sure if they rewrite it, it'll probably pass through. But like I was saying, if you're looking for this, find your local psychedelic society. Go to a local metaphysical store. Usually the witches know. Or an herbalist or a naturopathic doctor. Go to a farmer's market and just look around, or ask the universe to help you find a source, because I swear to Goddess, like, she will provide. Like, you will suddenly hear a friend talking about this. If you listen to this podcast, then your algorithm is probably going to pop up one of the legitimate companies operating online, because there are legitimate companies from Colorado and Oregon that are operating, they're legally operating within their states.
Wow.
And and they sometimes ship to other states.
There you go.
So
there's the workaround
to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I love what you say, what you're doing. I think, we said it before, but all of what you're talking about needs to be talked about more, whether it's women's care, the self-talk, the shame that is around trauma, like whatever it is. I love all of the things that you're saying. Incredibly messy.
So messy.
I love it though. I love it. And you seem to have come out of that mess and now, helping others go through their trauma and being their guidance. And I think that's just so, like I said, I'm kind of attached to this word power, but I think it's so powerful. And I enjoyed you so, so much. Where can people find you?
So you can find me on Instagram at Leslie Draffin. I also have a podcast, which Sarah will be a guest on soon, The Light Within. And if you're listening to this and you feel interested in checking out more about microdosing, I have a free guide, which you downloaded today.
I did.
Activate Your Inner Magic. It is a beginner's guide to intentional microdosing. It explains safe sourcing. It also includes a meditation. And then in early May, I am launching my cyclical microdosing method mini course, which is a free 5-day course emailed straight to you on the microdosing protocol I created to help optimize your microdosing through syncing with your cycle. This is definitely something that I recommend for anyone who has a menstrual cycle and even women who are no longer bleeding, because when we look at how much our cycle impacts our life in general, of course it would impact our microdosing, and yet no microdosing protocol has been created by a woman. So I will explain how to start a microdosing practice, how to work with your cycle, including how to track your cycle if you've never started. We'll talk about setting intentions for a practice with microdosing, which I feel is like one of the biggest things.
Yeah, I read that. You really have to get laser focused on why you're starting this journey, which then helps you receive what you're going to receive. So if you have the intentions, mapped out for yourself, right, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. And it also talks about integration, which is really the key, right? Because you can sit with medicine time after time, but if you're not looking at the messages that it brings up for you, then you're just going to still sit in your mess.
Yeah. Yeah. And we want to sit with you through your mess, but we want you to come out of your mess for sure. So, all right. And then last thing, sort of something new I was trying out, but I am asking my guest to ask a messy question for the next guest.
Oh my God. Okay. That's a new. All right. Let me think about this. So I ask them a question and they'll answer in the next. Okay. Oh my goodness. Let me think. I would say, and this is maybe out of left field, but when was the last time you allowed yourself to feel pleasure in your body? And if it wasn't today, why not?
Great question. I love it. I love it. And that's messy. So I like that. I love it.
Literally and figuratively.
Yes. No, yes. Hopefully they're really going to have to think about that one. So, all right, Leslie, you've been fabulous. Thank you so much for taking the time coming on Everything's Messy podcast. I wish you all of the luck. I hope to talk to you again. I think you're just amazing, and I really appreciate you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for listening to Everything's Messy podcast. If you don't mind, if you'd head on over to wherever you listen to the podcast, like, subscribe, maybe leave me a review. I would really appreciate it. Also, make sure to check out my new website, www.everythingsmessy.com. Social media is where you can find me. Instagram at Everything's Messy Podcast. Same with Facebook. I'm on X at Everything's Mess. And if you'd like to reach out to me for email, I'm everythingsmessy@gmail.com. Once again, thank you so much for listening and keep it messy.